Hello, this is Charles Brewer, President of the Civil War Study Group here at Lake of the Woods, Virginia. Welcome to this, the recording of our program on January 26, 2024. So good morning. Thank you all for coming, especially on this sunny day. And my watch says it's 69 degrees outside. Who knew on January the 26th, 2024 that it would be this warm? I'm a little disappointed that I don't see any shorts in this group. You people have got to be more flexible. Okay. I'd like members of our board to stand for a moment. Please stand, members of the board. Yes, right. Actually, the lady in blue is not a late arrival. Well, okay, she is, but she's also on our board as well. So, we have the unique distinction, I think, amongst groups here at Lake of the Woods that we have a married couple on our board. All right, great. But at any rate, a reminder that our artifacts cabinet has been moved. It's no longer at the clubhouse because of the renovations that they were doing. We lost our space there. However, we think we got actually a premium space that might be more conducive to people standing in front for a good amount of time to actually spend time looking at the artifacts. It's at the Wood Center, the entry vestibule, right next to the card playing room and whatever else that room there is. The trophy room, I think it's called, but in any event. So please visit there, tell your friends about it, so that all the hard work done by the group led by Joe Rokas will have not been in vain. Okay? All right. Thank you. We'd like to remind you that we received a challenge grant. I sent out an email last month about this. One of our key goals in life is to elevate the understanding of local history, and one of the things that we do every year is there was a hiatus during the pandemic, but we grant a scholarship for a local teacher to go to the American Battlefields Trust annual Teacher Institute in the summer, and we did have a challenge grant that came in, and I'm glad to say that we've gotten some pretty good response, but we actually need more response. So our website now has a donate button, which takes you directly to a donation page, which has been there for the last 10 years, but who wants to go through the menu choices? But at any rate, please be generous. We're actually working on adding the capability of making donations using your PayPal or credit cards, so we'll make it much easier for you. So watch out for that. Please be on the lookout for emails, probably within the next month, asking for volunteers. Once again, this is an issue, a program of ours that was on hiatus during the pandemic. But the fourth graders every year, the local schools have a history project where they're supposed to make a poster of some historic issue or personage of their interest, and one of the things that they're challenged on is their use of primary documentation and secondary documentation and their ability to distinguish that. And we have a rubric that as judges we go through, and it's a lot of fun. I have to say that in the past I've been a little bit tougher than some of our more soft judges, but we do have a get-together at the clubhouse for the children that got to the blue ribbon status in their own individual schools. So that's always fun, but we can't get there until we have the judging. So please watch out for that email so that you can participate. Hopefully, it's a lot of fun. Oh, yes, please, that's another thing. Please turn off your cell phones. But I'm glad it's not mine, because I myself forgot to silence mine. Here I am. There. Right. In any event, one of the posters, for instance, that I judged was on the life of James Madison, local guy, right? And the young person said that he was a graduate of James Madison University. But anyway, with the reopening of the clubhouse next week, January 31st, you may not have heard that, but I heard it from the lips of Ryan Richardson himself on Thursday of last week. We will be able to have our February meeting in the usual place, the Great Hall. So please mark your calendars for that. The speaker will be someone of note or notoriety, myself. And I'll be talking on the United States Colored Troops at Wilderness, a demographic profile, so that you can enjoy the fruits of my labor, which made a computer widow of my lovely wife. So she has a sigh of relief. At any rate, our speaker today is historian Kevin Pollack, whose topic will be the heaviest blow yet given to the Confederacy. The Emancipation Proclamation changes the Civil War. And I want to thank him for that topic, because it sort of like dovetails into my February topic. But in any event, many of you will remember that Kevin was our speaker at our February meeting last year and was well received. But in any event, Kevin is a 2014 graduate of Shepherd University. That was only 9 or so years ago. Well, yeah, but his accomplishments since have, filled quite a roster, so I'm not going to cover them all. So he's been a busy guy. He also sits on the board of directors of the Shepherdstown Battlefield Preservation Association and the Save Historic Antietam Foundation. He is a licensed guide for Antietam Battlefield, and but at any rate, he's a regular contributor to Emerging Civil War blog and co-authored a book in the Emerging Civil War series. He's featured in 9 videos in the C-SPAN video library, and fortunately we have, we have some books that if you want to come up afterwards and purchase them, please do. And I want to note that if you pay cash, there's a special price for that.
Thank you all very much. Can you all hear me in the back? All right. I used to work at Harper's Ferry and used to have to compete with trains on a daily basis, so I can be quite loud. So if you can't hear me in the back for whatever reason, I get quiet, which is not likely to happen. But if, just in case that does happen, feel free to let me know, and I'll be happy to speak up. But it's great to see so many people here today. See a lot of familiar faces and certainly some new faces as well. So thank you all for coming out. It's a pleasure to be here talking about what I would consider, I always joke that talking about the Emancipation Proclamation always brings a lot of people in because it's a relatively controversial topic, and I'll get into why that is in a little bit. I've had 2 connections with the Emancipation Proclamation. One is, of course, being a guide at Antietam. The Emancipation Proclamation, or at least the announcement of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, comes out as a direct result of the Maryland campaign, and the Battle of Antietam is a climactic battle of that campaign. And also the research that was done to put this presentation together was part of an essay book that I did years ago with the Southern Illinois University Press about turning points of the Civil War. And the whole purpose of the book was arguing that there's not one turning point of the Civil War, there are many. And you constantly have this pendulum going back and forth of momentum between the United States and the Confederate States. And so what you're going to see today is sort of a summation of all that. So you don't have to go out and buy yourself another book. If you take good notes, you'll get it all right here. But what I want to do with this presentation is kind of break it up into 3 parts. One, we're going to look at where does it... That's my ring. Oh. Always my worry is that it's going to be me. We're going to break it up into 3 parts. One is going to look at sort of the origins of the proclamation itself. Why does Abraham Lincoln issue it during the course of the war? The second part is going to be what exactly is the proclamation? What does it do or not do? And the third part is going to be, is it a turning point of the Civil War? And as you can probably tell by the subtitle, I think it is. And I'll explain why that is in a couple of different ways. So firstly, one of the reasons I think the Emancipation Proclamation draws such a crowd is not just because of Abraham Lincoln. Uh-oh.
Do you have it on?
It is on. Yep. Ooh, what's that noise? But anyway.
Oh, here.
You got it? All right, yeah, you can go to the next one.
Oh, you know what?
Uh-oh.
There we are. Okay, now go. Okay.
Hey, all right. Is because you get a lot of divergent reactions about the Emancipation Proclamation and about Abraham Lincoln himself. Is Lincoln the great emancipator, like what you see him there on the left, or is the Emancipation Proclamation and Lincoln's abolitionist stances a demon-inspired sort of thing, like this drawing from German artist Adelbert Wolff? You can see Abraham Lincoln is sitting here writing the proclamation in his office in the White House. There's a lot of symbolism into this. You can see he has a painting of Saint Osawatomie. That would be John Brown. You can see John Brown is there with a halo, and he's carrying one of his infamous pikes with him, implying that Lincoln has been inspired by John Brown, who of course many people in the South did not like. That literally there's a demon sitting here on Lincoln's desk. This shows is a drawing of some of the slave revolts in Haiti that took place at the turn of the 18th to the 19th century, so it's implying that Lincoln is trying to incite a race war. So what is it? Is the Emancipation Proclamation what you see there on the left, or what you see on the right? Before we really get into the proclamation, we have to take a little bit of a look at what were Abraham Lincoln's views on slavery itself. And one of a famous historian, of course now I just blanked on his name naturally, but gave this the term of Lincoln's view, sort of Lincoln's view of the American dream was the right to rise. That as an American, you had the right to rise as far as you could carry yourself. Sort of Lincoln referred to it as pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. And he says this in many different terms. This is one of my favorite quotes describing that. He's speaking to an Ohio regiment that's parked out in front of the lawn of the White House in August of 1864. And he says, you can see some of that quote, I'll expand on a little bit more. It is not merely for today, but for all time to come, that we should perpetuate for our children's children this great and free government which we have enjoyed all our lives. I beg you to remember this, not for my sake, but for yours. I happen temporarily to occupy this big White House. I am a living witness that any one of your children may look to come here as my father's child has. It is in order that each of you may have, through this free government which we have enjoyed, an open field and a fair chance for your industry, enterprise, and intelligence, that you may all have equal privileges in the race of life with all its desirable human aspirations. It is for this the struggle should be maintained, that we may not lose our birthright, not only for 1, but for 2 or 3 years. The nation is worth fighting for to secure an inestimable jewel. Of course, Lincoln did not mention race, except for the race of life, but not race in terms of humanity in that quote, but I think it really sums up what Lincoln's opposition to slavery was. And he says, in 1854, I love this too, most governments have been based practically on the denial of equal rights of men, as I have in part stated them previously in his speech. He says, ours, the United States, ours began by affirming those rights to mankind. So what slavery denied to millions of African Americans throughout the United States and then the American South, in Lincoln's view, was the ability to rise, the right to rise that every natural-born human had in the United States as Abraham Lincoln viewed it. Now, what's also interesting, and this always comes up, and this is admittedly one of my big bugaboos, when Lincoln is debating whether or not to issue a proclamation of emancipation to try and abolish slavery throughout the United States, he's getting a lot of pressure, and we're going to go into this a bit more, as to why he gets all this pressure to do it. And Lincoln is from the viewpoint of radical Republicans in Congress and throughout the United States, Lincoln was very slow to move toward emancipation ultimately. And he got pressure publicly through newspapers, including one newspaper editor from New York, Horace Greeley, who wrote that it was the prayers of 20 million people in the United States that Lincoln issue a proclamation of emancipation, or at least move to abolish slavery. And Lincoln replied publicly to Greeley's letter a couple of days later. This is probably a Lincoln quote that you have heard. He says, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." How many of you have heard that quote before? Okay, Lincoln's a little wishy-washy. What is often missed is this quote is so often repeated, but if you read the entire letter, what Lincoln goes on to say, he says, "I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty." His duty is as President of the United States. Abraham Lincoln, his entire life, did not believe that slavery could be abolished constitutionally. We'll get more of that in a bit. But he continues, he says, "I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free." So Lincoln felt that initially it was not within his power as president to abolish slavery, but personally he wished to see that done ultimately. So we're going to rewind the clock here a little bit. To January 27th, almost. I was making this slide and I thought, oh, great. But we're one day ahead, that's okay. To January 27th, 1862. Here's a view, of course, of the United States at that time. This is taken from a YouTube video that somebody put together. You can follow it. It's like 4 minutes long. It's the Civil War in 4 minutes, I think it's called. And you can follow and as you watch it, you can follow progressions of like Confederate invasions of the North, Union troops moving into the South. It's pretty cool. But this is the boundary. You can see where the blue is, of course. It's Union-occupied territory on January 27, 1862. The red is going to be Confederate-occupied territory as of that date as well. And why I picked this date is because on January 27th, Abraham Lincoln issued General War Order No. 1, which said that on February 22nd, 1862, which was George Washington's birthday, that be the day that's designated for naval and armed forces of the United States to advance and engage the Confederate armies across many different fronts. Now what that's going to do is once, by 1862, there are questions about emancipation really as soon as the first guns are fired on Fort Sumter in April of 1861. But what you start to see throughout 1862, which to me is the instrumental year of the Civil War, as the Union armies advance, and here now you see by July 22nd, 1862, you all see that little magic there on the screen. Let me rewind it for you. Okay, so here's January 27th. The line is, you can see basically the Tennessee border, Tennessee-Kentucky border. Most of what's now West Virginia is under Union occupation. Very little of the coast, though. The coastline of the Confederacy is under Union occupation. By July 22nd, 1862, you can see the Federal Army has made some inroads into the shell of the Confederacy. It's hard to tell over here, but there are Federal troops just outside of Richmond following the Peninsula Campaign. You'll see pretty much most of northern Arkansas, western and central Tennessee has been occupied into the northern fringes of Alabama and Mississippi. Of course, Federal troops have made a huge, there were some large inroads down in the Mississippi Delta, around New Orleans and beyond. And what this does is, for the first time now, you commonly hear this phrase, most Civil War soldiers had never been more than 15 miles away from their home. So what did somebody from New York or Michigan or Wisconsin know about slavery besides what they had read about it? Now, for the first time, you have thousands of Northerners, more than thousands, hundreds of thousands of Northerners, that are getting to see slavery firsthand. And a lot of the places where these federal inroads are made in the summer of 1862 are places with very high slave populations. So, for example, Williamson County, Tennessee had a population of 52% slave. Fayette County, Tennessee, another one of these Tennessee counties that's under federal control now, 64% of their population was enslaved. Down in the Virginia Peninsula, Warwick County, 60%, Charles City County, 62%, New Kent County, 61%. So now, we're going to get into this debate a little bit about who actually abolished slavery in the United States. And this is something that's been a common debate among historians. Is it Union soldiers that are pushing because they're interacting with slaves? Is it Union soldiers that are writing letters home and pushing their representatives in their state congresses and state delegations and federal delegations to do something about this? Is it the slaves themselves that are running to Union lines, that are forcing Union Army commanders to say, we have these thousands of people here, what do we do with them? Because there is no policy early on in the Civil War of what to do with them. Is it Abraham Lincoln that's pushing this? Is it Congress? And again, it's sort of a revolving door, every 10, 15 years. It's like the studies that come out every 10, 15 years and they say coffee's going to kill you at the age of 40. And then it says, no, coffee will make you live to your 140. Every 10, 15 years, the debate sort of changes. Is it Lincoln? Is it Congress? Is it the Federal Army? Is it the slaves themselves? I think it's all four. Everybody has a role in all of this. But what you're going to see, and keep in mind this date, July 22nd, 1862, that's going to be an important date in the story of the Emancipation Proclamation. But because of these inroads that federal troops have made into the Confederacy, now this is really becoming a problem of what do we do with these thousands of people who are running to our lines. We now have to feed them, clothe them, they're looking for freedom. What's our policy? And so pressure is building on the Lincoln administration to come up with a policy ultimately. Now, there were some earlier efforts at emancipation earlier on in the Civil War. I think this says something about Abraham Lincoln himself. This is John C. Fremont, who was actually the first Republican candidate for the presidency in the election of 1856. He was commanding out west of the Mississippi River in Missouri. On August 30th, he placed the state of Missouri under martial law, and part of that included that the property of Missourians, including slaves, because back then, of course, slaves were counted as property, would be free. Abraham Lincoln found out about this. Bye-bye, John C. Fremont. Okay? Fremont is going beyond the bounds of his being a general in the United States Army to free slaves and declare slaves free. So Lincoln rescinds that. Then we'll bring up David Hunter, who's commanding a district in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. May 9th, 1862, Hunter is going to announce a proclamation of emancipation within his district that's going to free all the slaves within his district. Abraham Lincoln rescinds that order as well, saying that, again, you are going beyond the bounds of what your role is as a general in the United States, that this is a constitutional thing. This is not something that you can decide. Though what these efforts are starting to show Lincoln is that military emancipation, there is a precedent for military emancipation. And actually, members of Congress, including most prominently John Quincy Adams, who of course is president and then becomes a member of Congress again after his presidency, even back in the 1830s, John Quincy Adams was making arguments that military emancipation was legal under certain conditions. And so you're starting to see, again, more pressure building on Lincoln. The public, or some members of the public at least, some very vocal members of the public, and very vocal members of Congress are not reacting well to Lincoln rescinding these orders of emancipation. So the pressure is building on Abraham Lincoln itself. Congress was starting to make moves toward not so much emancipation, but at least dictating what could happen to slaves that were known as contraband that ran into Union lines. Those two things come into play with the first Confiscation Act in August of 1861, which basically says that owners who claimed fugitive slaves who came into Union lines to claim their fugitive slaves, they could not have them if those slaves had been employed in the Confederate war effort. The United States Congress will go a step further in July 1862, and all this is really going to come to a head with the second Confiscation Act, saying, as you see up there, anybody engaged in the rebellion that owns slaves, their slaves will be free, whether those slaves have been used to aid the Confederate war effort or not. So that's the big difference between those two. This will also sort of buttress Lincoln's claim of what he had done with Fremont and Hunter. It will forbid the United States military from deciding on whether a fugitive is free or not. And it allows the president to employ African Americans to aid in the suppression of the rebellion of the southern states as they viewed it. So this is also going to come into play, of course, with the Emancipation Proclamation. So Lincoln is also working on his own plans at emancipation. Basically, if you go and look at Lincoln's idea, I mentioned earlier on, Lincoln did not believe that slavery could be eliminated constitutionally. There was a movement in the Republican Party, in the Free Soil Party, before the Republicans became a thing, in the 1850s, and it was basically, the idea was, and this is why Lincoln jumps back into the political fray once the United States is expanding west. This is why I think the Civil War happens when it does, is because as the United States is expanding west, the question becomes, are those new territories going to be slave territories or are they free territories? And it had been very much a Republican, most people did not think that you could just eliminate slavery through the Constitution. But what Republicans were trying to do was basically build, they called it the scorpion sting. They hoped that the scorpion sting would eliminate slavery. So what that is, I've never tried this, and I hope nobody in here ever has, that's what I've heard. If you take a scorpion and you surround them with a ring of fire, rather than burning to death, the scorpion is going to sting itself to death. It doesn't have to burn up. Again, I've never tried it, that's just what I've heard. So this was an analogy that was used by Republicans at the time, because what you do to eliminate slavery is you surround the slave states with free states. You don't allow slavery to expand, and slowly, one by one, that's going to financially undermine slavery because it can't grow. And southern states themselves are going to step in and say, well, this is no longer financially feasible, so we're going to get rid of slavery. And they're playing the long game, right, in this very much. That was the idea. So what Lincoln was trying to do as well, aside from what Congress was doing, Lincoln was trying to work out gradual compensated emancipation plans with several states. The first state he worked with was the state of Delaware, which was, of course, a very small state. Slavery was still legal there. There weren't many slaves there anyway. Slavery was dying in Delaware. But Lincoln thought if he could come up with a plan to show that it was financially feasible to have the slaves of the state gradually emancipated and have the owners of those slaves financially compensated for the loss of their property, that would show southern states, those states in rebellion, that this is a plan, and it's worked, and that might entice those southern states to come back into the United States. So that's the idea. That's all of what Lincoln's thinking. Now, the Delaware plan doesn't work at all. Also on July 12th, 5 days before the Second Confiscation Act, Lincoln is going to meet with border state delegates from Kentucky. And he's going to propose this gradual compensated emancipation plan to them as well, and they will shut him down completely. And so the next day, Abraham Lincoln is riding to a cemetery to witness the burial of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton's infant son. And Lincoln's going to be riding in the carriage, this is on July 13, 1862, with Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles and Secretary of State William Seward. And of course, here's Lincoln in the middle. And that's when Lincoln is first going to broach to both Seward and Welles the idea of an Emancipation Proclamation. 9 days later, Lincoln is going to show his first draft of what becomes the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. He will tell his cabinet basically, I'm showing you this document in trust, don't go out and tell everybody about it, keep it secret. And basically Lincoln said, I'm showing this to you, but my mind is made up. You can't convince me otherwise. This is going to happen, but I'm happy to take comments and edits and things like that. So the most influential voice in the room that day was Secretary of State William Seward, who was also an abolitionist, or very much anti-slavery at least. And Seward told Lincoln, Mr. President, I like your idea, but to issue the proclamation now, in the summer of July 1862, when things are not going good for the Northern War effort, would look, as Seward put it in only words that William Seward could, it would look like the last shriek on the retreat, was how he put it. Meaning to issue the proclamation now, it's not going to look like you're doing this out of some moral idea or some, following your moral compass, anything like that. Instead, it's going to look like an act of desperation. And that's not going to come off well with our own population, but also internationally as well. And so Lincoln agrees. He agrees to wait to announce the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation until a federal victory, federal armies in the field gain a victory. So Lincoln folded up that document, put it in his desk. It was very much a working document. He constantly would take things out and scribble notes on it and change words here and there. But Lincoln had to wait a long time, probably a lot longer than he thought he would. There was a chance he could have done it in August of 1862, when John Pope's Army of Virginia confronted Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia just outside the gates of the federal capital at Manassas. And it's the Battle of Second Manassas. It's going to end not well for the Federals at all. It's going to be one of Robert E. Lee's, I would argue, Lee's greatest victory. And it's going to drive that Federal Army back into the defenses of Washington. This is the darkest days of the American Civil War for the United States at this point. So Lincoln is still waiting. He's waited over a month now at this point to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Of course, Lee's army is going to move north across the Potomac River into Maryland. A federal army under the command of George McClellan will move out from behind the defenses of Washington. We're not going to get into any of the military details at all, but McClellan will achieve the goal of driving the Confederate Army out of Maryland and back into Virginia. And, of course, that will be accomplished most notably the battles of South Mountain on September 14th and Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American military history, on September 17th as well. Lincoln claimed that he had made a promise to himself, he didn't tell anybody about it, to himself and to God, that when he learned that the rebel army, as he put it, was north of the Potomac River in Maryland, that if the Federals could get the Confederates out of Maryland and back into Virginia, that would be a sign from God that what Lincoln was trying to do, announcing this preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, would be the thing to do. So that was his bar for victory, to get the Confederates out of Maryland and back into Virginia. Of course they will. And 5 days following the Battle of Antietam, Abraham Lincoln is going to announce to the country on September 22nd, 1862, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. We'll get into some of the differences between the two in just a moment, but the big thing you got to know about the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation is it's essentially an ultimatum. What it says is, to the southern states, if you do not come back and renew your bonds with the United States and end the rebellion in 100 days, which just so happened to be January 1st, 1863, then Lincoln would actually issue the Emancipation Proclamation and free what equated to be about 3.1 million slaves in the Confederate States. Now we'll talk about whether or not it freed all of them in just a moment. But that was the idea of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. So Lincoln continued working on the document. This is him. You can see he's writing on the proclamation. I don't think Lincoln was this messy of a man, but his office was much nicer. But again, it's a great piece of artwork showing Lincoln working on this proclamation. There was some conviction amongst many people thinking that Lincoln wouldn't actually follow through with the proclamation on January 1st, 1863, of actually signing it. Because the Northern War effort, while he'd gotten this victory in the summer of 1862, and Federal armies have achieved victories elsewhere, days before January 1st, 1863, the Federal war effort has taken another real deep downslide. Losses at, of course, the Battle of Fredericksburg, December 13th, 1862. Ulysses S. Grant's first attempt to seize Vicksburg along the Mississippi River falls short. And during that time, December 31st, 1862, William Rosecrans' army has just suffered a pretty severe bloody nose outside of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, at the Battle of Stones River. So there are a lot of people thinking Lincoln might back out of this. He might chicken out on this proclamation because maybe it's not being backed by the military anymore. At least there's no military might that will support a document like this. So January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln had what he called his public opinion bath, which was opening the doors of the White House to greet thousands of Americans, and you can imagine him standing there in line, shaking hand after hand after hand, and talking and spinning his homespun stories, as he was apt to do when he was eventually called away by Secretary of State William Seward to sign into effect the final Emancipation Proclamation. And according to the story, Lincoln took his pen out of the inkstand, and as he was about to sign his name on the proclamation, his hand was shaking very radically like this. And he grabbed his right hand with his left hand to steady it, and looked around the room and made it known. He said, basically, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, he said, I don't want people to think that I was nervous about issuing this proclamation. So Lincoln steadied his hand and signed the proclamation into effect on January 1st, 1863. Reality, probably what Lincoln said, his hand was shaking so much because he'd been shaking thousands of hands in the last few hours. So he had to study his hand that way. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are some differences between the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation and the final product that ultimately comes out on January 1st. Because again, the preliminary document was a working document. It was basically just, it really was a draft, and an ultimatum again saying, here's your warning, but wait for the final one to come out ultimately. So in the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, there is mention of colonization of freed slaves, of getting freed slaves out of the United States and colonizing them elsewhere. There's no mention of that in the final proclamation. Lincoln is also going to, in the preliminary proclamation, again remember this is an ultimatum, he's trying to entice the southern states to come back into the Union. He's going to recommend to Congress in the preliminary proclamation financial assistance to slave owners. Again, trying to follow along with that gradual, compensated emancipation. Also, lastly, some words that caused angst among quite a few people. Remember back to that drawing I showed you at the beginning where Lincoln is, he's got Osawatomie Brown, John Brown overlooking him, and the slave revolt in Haiti. Lincoln said at the end of the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation that the United States, quote, will do no act or acts to repress such persons in any efforts they may make for actual freedom. What worried a lot of people there is Lincoln enticing the slave rebellion in the southern states, which is, nobody wanted a slave rebellion in North America at that point. So in the final proclamation, Lincoln is going to change the word there. And instead, what those words will be is, I hereby enjoin upon the people, so declared, to be free, to abstain from all violence, unless in necessary self-defense. And I recommend to them that in all cases when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. So he's specifically saying, unless it's in self-defense, don't act violently about this. The last thing that the final proclamation is going to do is that it's going to allow African Americans into the United States military, which is going to be a big boon to the numbers of the military itself. So, when thinking about the Emancipation Proclamation, when thinking about Abraham Lincoln, certain documents of his come to mind. Gettysburg Address, Lincoln-Douglas debates, Second Inaugural Address. The Emancipation Proclamation, unfortunately, in my mind, isn't often the first to come to mind. And why is that? Well, as one Lincoln historian put it, it has all the moral grandeur of a bill of lading, which is basically if you go down the road to Sheets or whatever, and you get a receipt, that's what he said, that's your bill of lading. That it has all the moral grandeur of that. It's not anything that has these flowery terms from Lincoln. It's not a speech. This is an official presidential decree. It's a document that's going to have to survive courts potentially. And so Lincoln is not going to use any of this, gift of language in that. Another man said, so is it that? Is it just this moral, lacking of moral grandeur? Somebody else said it will stand as the great act of the age. It will prove to be wise in statesmanship as it is patriotic. It will be enthusiastically approved and sustained, and future generations will, as I do, say, God bless you for the great and noble act. So what is the proclamation? It doesn't do anything. It's somewhere in between. Is it one of those? So let's get into the third part of the program. What did it actually do? As I mentioned, you can see there, big letters at the bottom, theoretically, because Abraham Lincoln never viewed the southern states as being out of the United States, out of his purview. Of course, they did. They said, he's not our president. But Lincoln viewed himself as still being the president of the entirety of what had been the United States, so to include the United States and Confederate States. So in Lincoln's mind, he's freed 3.1 million slaves with a stroke of the pen. Wow. Now, in reality, of course, Southerners are going to say, so what? Come down and enforce it if you want to, but their slaves are not free at this point. Also, there were some exceptions that were built in to the Emancipation Proclamation. So one of the common arguments that I hear about the Proclamation is, okay, it says it freed 3.1 million slaves. Immediately with the stroke of a pen, well, those slaves were freed immediately on January 1st, 1863, so the Proclamation didn't do anything. it didn't free any slaves, because what Lincoln specifically put down and wrote down in the Proclamation was that it would free slaves in territory not overseen by the United States Army. So they have no jurisdiction there. The United States government has no jurisdiction there. However, there were some exceptions that Lincoln built into the document. So where you see the red here on these maps, along the seacoast here, especially in North Carolina and Northern Virginia as well, those are areas under federal occupation that were not exempted by the Emancipation Proclamation, meaning January 1st, 1863, 10,000 plus slaves that lived in all these regions here are immediately freed come January 1st, 1863. So it does free some. Another question that I often get, or a point I get about the Proclamation, is it did not end slavery forever, and it did not abolish slavery in places like Maryland, which is, of course, never seceded from the United States and joined the Confederacy, Kentucky, Missouri, Western Virginia, things like that. That's absolutely true. But before even the 13th Amendment became a thing in 1865, all those states, state governments had established their own measures of abolition in slavery. So Lincoln sort of knew that this was going to happen. West Virginia, which is entirely exempted from the Emancipation Proclamation, it's irrelevant anyway because just a couple of days prior to signing the final proclamation, Lincoln signed or pushed forward West Virginia's statehood bill, and it had been built into the bill of West Virginia statehood that there would be a gradual emancipation plan. So slavery is already going to be dead in West Virginia anyway by the time Lincoln will sign the proclamation. The proclamation is sort of a clarion call to slaves as well that learned about it and heard about it to go to Union lines to achieve their freedom any way that they possibly could. And so it's interesting, down in the Norfolk area here, how many of you have been to Fortress Monroe? The tip of the, okay, very good, the York James Peninsula. Of course, it's known as Freedom's Fortress. That's really where one of the first issues comes to a head about what do we do with fugitive slaves running away. In the first 20 months of the war, there were approximately 3,000 fugitive slaves that made their way to Fortress Monroe. From January to May 1863, 5 months after the proclamation, 7,000 arrived. In 5 months after the proclamation, versus only 3,000 in 20 months before the proclamation. All told, approximately 1/4 of the South's pre-war slaves would be freed and find refuge within Union lines by the end of the Civil War. So that equates out to about 1 million or so. So the proclamation does initially free some slaves by the stroke of the pen, but it also serves as a call for slaves to run to Union lines to achieve their freedom. So there are slaves that are freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. From a diplomatic perspective, what did it do? It did basically serve as, you're going to use football analogy, served as a stiff arm from Abraham Lincoln to keep foreign intervention out of America's conflict. Now initially, and this was something as I started really researching more into the Proclamation, I'd always heard that at Lincoln, there's some thought out there that Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation to do just that, to keep Britain and France out of the war. Lincoln actually had the opposite worry when he announced the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. His worry was that it might actually bring Britain and France into trying to mediate the war because Britain had such a connection to American slavery. Cotton mills supported about 20% of Britain's industry. During the war, of course, the blockade of the Confederate States was making those British cotton mills suffer quite a bit and really damaging and hurting British industry. This was a line of unemployed Brits during the Civil War that are going to get money and food. So the thought was that by freeing slaves, England and France might actually try to come in and at least mediate an end to the Civil War, if not recognize the Confederacy. However, it worked out completely the opposite. Great Britain had quite the history with slavery, not to mention, again, go back to those words, there was worry that Lincoln's proclamation might entice slaves to rebel. Well, Britain had just dealt with its own rebellion of sorts, the Sepoy Mutiny, in India in 1857, 1858, and that really rocked their empire and rocked the world, and they were not too keen on seeing another such large rebellion like that, at least sort of a racial rebellion like they had seen in India. And also, Great Britain had abolished slavery throughout its empire in 1833, 30 years before the Emancipation Proclamation had been issued. So it's not going to be a good look for the British if you say 30 years ago we freed all of our slaves. Well, now we're going to step in and recognize a nation that has 4 million slaves in its population. So ultimately, the Emancipation Proclamation will serve as a stiff arm of sorts to keep Britain and France out of the war here. As I talked about, the Emancipation Proclamation is going to spur slaves to go and run toward Union lines. This is a picture actually from before the Proclamation, but it's one of the most tangible pieces of evidence that we have of this. I actually drove right by here on my way here. This is the Rappahannock River. For those of you familiar with Route 15, if you cross the Rappahannock River, you'll come to the town of Remington, which is known as Rappahannock Station. That's back here. The Route 15 bridge is just off the picture here. This is the Rappahannock River. You can see a family of formerly enslaved people. These are all Union soldiers here that have run to Union lines to seek protection. So that's going to happen throughout all of this as well. Generals will recognize this as well. Henry Halleck, at this point the General-in-Chief of the United States Armies, wrote to Ulysses S. Grant, well, Grant's still out in Mississippi, actually Louisiana at this point, in March of 1863, he said, so long as the rebels retain and employ their slaves in producing grains, etc., they can employ all the whites in the field. Every slave withdrawn from the enemy is equivalent to a white man put forward to combat, which is a casualty. So what he's saying here is that by releasing or freeing slaves, that the Confederacy can no longer use them to be teamsters, cooks, things like that behind the lines. And so in order to have somebody drive the wagons now, you're not going to be able, the Confederacy won't be able to rely on slave power to do that. You're going to have to take somebody that would usually have a gun out in the front lines, take them away from that, take that gun out of their hands to go drive a wagon. So that's some of this military necessity as well. Kirby Smith, a Confederate commander out west of the Mississippi River, said every sound male black left for the enemy becomes a soldier whom we afterward have to fight. This is also the case, of course. Remember, one of the big changes between the preliminary proclamation and the final proclamation was Lincoln's call that African American men could now be enlisted into the United States Army to help serve. And ultimately, over 180,000 black men will be enlisted into the United States Army, and that's going to further tip the balance in terms of military-age men that can fight in the United States Army. It's going to further tip the balance of strength in favor of the United States over the Confederate States. And ultimately, Civil War arithmetic is never an exact thing, but 79,000 black soldiers came from northern states, like you see here, the 54th Massachusetts. All seen the movie Glory, right? If you haven't, you should go see it. But most of the 54th Massachusetts was made up of educated, free black men from the north. So this is one example of them. This is their attack on Fort Wagner outside of Charleston, South Carolina in July 1863. However, more black soldiers in the United States Army came from the South, about 94,000 as compared to 79,000. Some of that is from the proclamation itself. One of the things that the proclamation is really going to do is it ratchets up the stakes in the Civil War. No longer is this a war about preserving the Union. No longer from the Confederacy's perspective, is this a war about achieving independence. It's now literally, as many Confederates viewed it, this is a fight for their way of life that they have grown up knowing their entire life, their way of living, their society. They're now fighting for that. And so the Emancipation Proclamation is really going to kick off the Black Flag era of the Civil War. Black Flag was a term used to really describe things like you're not going to take surrender, you're not going to take prisoners, you're going to be very hard towards your enemy, a hard type of war. And this is what you're going to see. Of course, famously, you have the incident at Fort Pillow out in Tennessee in April of 1864. It's not just going to be the Black Flag is not just going to be displayed by Confederate forces, though. It's going to be Federal forces as well. This is a sketch of the burning in the Shenandoah Valley in the summer and fall of 1864. So what this is really going to do is it really ratchets up the stakes. And no longer now, as I like to say, maybe, January 27th, 1862, let's say. If all of a sudden the Confederate States got together and said, okay, we give up, we're going to come back and join the United States, you could still relatively put Humpty Dumpty back together at that point, okay? By this point, there's no putting Humpty Dumpty back together in terms of recreating the United States as what it was before secession. And I think that has really played out well and said nicely by this man, who is Governor Charles Clark, who became governor of Mississippi in the midst of the Civil War in 1863. He was a Confederate soldier prior to the war. He had been he was a very good soldier by all accounts. He had been wounded twice, at Shiloh and at the Battle of Baton Rouge as well. But in his inaugural speech in 1864, he talked about what was at stake for Mississippians. And he said that because of the Proclamation, because of federal soldiers freeing slaves, he said we must fight the foe with renewed energy. Let the last of our young men die upon the field of battle. And when none are left to wield a blade or uphold our banner, then let our old men, our women, and our children, like the remnant of the heroic Pascagoulas, and I'll explain that reference in a moment, when their braves were slain, join hands together, march into the sea, and perish beneath its waters. There was the story of the Pascagoulas is in the 1830s as the United States is expanding westward. Pascagoulas were an Indian tribe that rather than submitting to the United States decided to essentially commit mass suicide. And the story was that they joined their hands, waded into the water, and drowned themselves. So that's what the Confederacy is fighting for at this point, is their way of life, to try and preserve that. And that's spelled out by Clark, and that's what the Proclamation does. Is it, again, I can't emphasize this enough. More so than diplomacy, more so than slaves running away for freedom, anything like that, the Emancipation Proclamation changes the world because it absolutely puts the stakes up to the highest level for Confederates to fight for Union soldiers to fight for, and that's where it really becomes an important piece and a turning point of the American Civil War. Just a few more quotes as I wrap this up. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, I think, sums it up pretty nicely about the Emancipation Proclamation. The hopes of freedom shook each day more and more the fabric built on human slavery. Karl Marx, watching the war from far, later ranked the Emancipation Proclamation beside the Declaration of Independence as the most important document in American history. And none other than Frederick Douglass, of course, had been pushing Lincoln from the start for some kind of proclamation of emancipation, had this to say, and I'm going to end on this: the 4th of July was great, but the 1st of January, when we consider it in all its relations and bearings, is incomparably greater. So thank you all very much, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that initially Lincoln was reluctant to issue the proclamation due to concerns about the constitutionality of it. How do you come to reconcile that?
13th Amendment ultimately became his. So there was some worry, certainly on Lincoln's mind, that eventually proclamation could be put in front of the Supreme Court and found to be an unlawful document. Because, again, the debate about was military emancipation legal. Again, that had been a debate in the United States for 30 plus years prior to that. Nobody had ever, there was no official wording on was it legal or not. So, toward the end of the war, when the 13th Amendment starts to be pushed for, and another great movie, which is pretty accurate, they're taking some liberties with things, but the movie Lincoln, with Daniel Day-Lewis as Lincoln, is the push for the 13th Amendment. And the amendment, by becoming a constitutional amendment, was the safeguard, if you will, to make sure that the proclamation and the people that it freed held up. Because, of course, once it becomes a constitutional amendment, I mean, it could be rescinded, but it's much harder to do that. And so that was what this is ultimately building toward, and then the 13th Amendment was what Lincoln used to basically set in stone what the proclamation did.
But he didn't know the 13th Amendment was going to happen.
No, he did not, but there had been pushes for that. Very early on, even. Actually, the original 13th Amendment would have allowed slavery to stay in the United States during Lincoln's early days of his presidency. But Lincoln was building up toward that. of trying to come up with some set-in-stone document that could survive legality and hold up in courts. Again, playing the long game, I guess, if that makes sense.
But he could have done that earlier, couldn't he? I mean,
He could have. Part of the problem, though, in order to get blind here. So in order to get an amendment to the Constitution, of course, he needed the state's approval. I'm not a legal scholar. 2/3, right? 2/3 states. Okay. I do military history usually. So in order to do that, again, Lincoln is viewing the Confederate States as still a part of the United States. All those states are not going to vote for the 13th Amendment, obviously. So what Lincoln needed to do was to establish governments in some of these Confederate states that had essentially been taken over by the Federals that would side with passing an amendment. So eventually that would become Tennessee, Louisiana, Missouri, and Arkansas, I believe. So what Lincoln will do, the federal government will do, is once these states are, again, essentially, if you want, they would have used the term conquer, but for sake of argument, let's say that. Then Lincoln would establish a state government that's loyal to the Union that will then support an amendment. So that's why he couldn't have done it earlier, is it wouldn't have had that support from those other states, because Lincoln wanted it to be not just the states that have remained loyal to the Union, but the entirety of the United States, as he thought, to be able to support the 13th Amendment. Yeah.
You know, I've always had the impression that there was a lot of pushback, even within the military, and there were significant numbers of Union officers that resigned their commissions over this time.
There were certainly some that did resign, Union officers that did resign over this. And yeah, it was not, I certainly don't want to paint the picture that the Proclamation came out and everybody said, oh good, joined hands, sang Kumbaya, and thought this is why we're fighting the war. At least from the federal perspective, there was a lot of angst about it, absolutely. Actually, ironically, somebody who was against it originally, find him here, was Colonel of the 54th Massachusetts, Robert Gould Shaw. Shaw said basically, he predicted, he said, this isn't going to do anything, because slaves are already running through our lines. What it's going to do is it's going to tick off the South even more, and they're going to fight harder now. And so Shaw was not a fan of the Proclamation. But I think, I don't have a number on it exactly. I think that more and more soldiers, federal soldiers, and again, I'm not saying all, certainly, did start to recognize that in order to beat the Confederacy on the battlefield, you had to be on the home front too. And that by undermining the system of slavery, that was hurting the Confederates on the front lines, because no longer now are you going to have thousands, hundreds of thousands of slaves behind the lines that are growing crops, repairing railroads, repairing roads, driving wagons, things like that. So they warmed up to the idea that this was good to at least bring about an end to the war. Now that does not mean there's still a lot of problems with racism in the United States at that point. It doesn't mean that a lot of these people who were for the Emancipation Proclamation grew to think it was a good thing, came to believe that African Americans were equal to them. That's not the case at all. But they at least believed in the short term that this was a good idea, and it was going to help them on the front lines and get them back home to their families sooner. Yes, sir.
You spoke of the factors that kept the Great Britain from getting the South in the Civil War. I'm under the impression that another factor was that at that time there was a bumper crop of cotton in Egypt. And so that they could get their cotton from Egypt, they didn't need to get it from the South.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. Yeah, so by the time that was discovered sort of in the summer of 1862. Excuse me, and so by the South really banked on, the South caught themselves in a catch-22, I guess. They had said that, we're blockaded, we can't get all this cotton to you. But then, so that's of course gonna hurt Great Britain, trying to then sort of backhandedly entice Great Britain to say, okay, we're gonna come in and break the blockade so Great Britain can get cotton. So there's hundreds of thousands of cotton bales sitting spoiling on decks in Charleston, South Carolina, and other places throughout the South that's not getting to Britain. by the time the South was playing that hand, though, you're absolutely right. Britain started looking for other avenues to get cotton, and they found quite a bit that they could grow quite a bit in Egypt, and so that started to replace the southern cotton. So King Cotton was no longer the bargaining chip that the South thought it might be earlier on in the war.
Tobacco.
Tobacco,
And rice.
Yes, yeah, they had rice and
but they couldn't
all sorts of.
Exchange.
No. Cotton was a big thing.
So what were they doing for tobacco in Europe?
Uh,
Turkish? I don't know.
That I don't know. I'm not sure about that. But cotton was the one that England was looking for. Yeah.
Cotton.
Yes.
As you mentioned that there were, potential legal challenges that could have happened. Were there any lower courts that took up the Emancipation as a legal executive order or anything like that?
Not that I am aware of. That's a good question. Honestly. I've never seen anything where that was taken up. If people made that argument, then I don't think it got very far. Yeah. I'll have to look into that. That's a good question.
Like today, we always have, orders that are challenged in courts, and that's a
Yes,
normal
yeah.
residential thing now.
Right, exactly.
There's a movement case.
Yeah. I think people had advised Lincoln that might happen, but I don't think it ever. Like you said, it may have in a lower court, but it never reached Supreme Court or anything like that.
I had a couple of diplomacy questions, but you covered them. The other thing about cotton is there were bumper crops just before the war kicked off. And so Britain, at the start of the war, had a surplus that they were able to kind of cover themselves with. They found the Egyptian cotton. And you mentioned John Quincy Adams. I recently read an excellent biography of him called The Lost Founding Father.
Oh, yeah.
A man named Cook. It's an excellent book. If you want to hear about Quincy Adams and the things that he did in his life is phenomenal.
Yeah, there's a couple good books on Adams' role in sort of promulgating this idea of military emancipation. There's one that just came out maybe 2 years ago. I think it's called Lincoln and the Quest for Abolitionists, but it's about John Quincy Adams and military emancipation. There's another one I have on my shelf. It's about 800 pages. The font is about size 2. And it's all about John Quincy Adams and Congress pushing this idea of military emancipation. Yeah, I haven't got to the end of it yet. Might go blind in the meantime. I saw another hand in the back there.
Yes, in January of 1863, what was the size of the Union military force and what was the size of the Confederate military force?
I would say I could ask the audience on this one. I don't have the numbers. I can say by the end of the war, it's about 2 million soldiers that will fight in the United States Army. Again, roughly, approximately. Confederate Army is about 750,000 or so that will fight. So the numbers are definitely in favor of the Federals. The closest that it ever really became in terms of total number of troops mobilized would have been the summer of 1862. Because by that point, Confederate conscription had kicked in. Some northern states had instituted drafts, but the federal draft wasn't going to come until the summer of 1863. So that's when you really start to see the disparity in numbers. And of course, the Federal Army is able to replace troops much easier because there's more military-age men that can replace casualties than what the Confederacy can do, because eventually the population rate, the population disparity between the two just starts to run down for the Confederates. So I don't have an exact number on when it was in January 1863. Yes.
It was interesting, your comment about Marx. I was at the museum in Trier, and he was living in Britain, and there were pictures. He was very much against young children working in the British mines, so he was very socially what we should be. But Marxism completely perverted now.
Yeah,
he was really.
It was interesting to read Marx's comments about that, and he actually had some very. You can find a lot of his comments about what he said about the Civil War. He had some very. I don't know. He says a lot of things like interesting things. The Emancipation Proclamation.
I think this country should learn about that. Somebody should write a book. Maybe there is a book about Marx and what he thought of slavery and child labor. And they needed it for economic reasons. The young children worked in the coal mines. Well, West Virginia.
Yeah, I'll say it won't be me. I won't write
No.
about
You don't want to do that book?
Yeah, no, not me. I got enough other projects on my plate.
That would be a good book.
Somebody can do it.
I'll do it. I'll do it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, very much. Has the sign up, no, not the sign up sheet, the email sheet, oh, look at that, my lovely bride has it. Has anyone had a chance to, did not get a chance, we'll put it on the corner of this table here, or else you can hand it to him. So once again, we will be at the clubhouse next month on February 23rd, so please come on out to that, and also remember to help us with our educational support projects by donating some money. So, but anyway, thank you very much for coming out, and now that it's 71 degrees outside, I expect some of you to don shorts this afternoon.
I wish I brought my golf
Thank you very much. Before you go, please remember to visit our website often, civilwarstudygroup.org. We make every attempt on a regular basis to provide informative content. Thank you for visiting, and God bless.